Okay, it's welcome everyone to our very first webinar. It is very strange to be speaking to all of you but not be able to see you. So I'm very excited to be welcoming you all, and it's our first webinar, as I did say, with studies in historical trauma and transformation. So for those of you who are connecting with us for the first time, Studies in Historical Trauma and Transformation is a research unit at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And the chair of the unit is Professor Pumla Madikizela, and she's on sabbatical at the moment, so I will be chairing this webinar and some of the webinars to follow in our series. So my name's Kim Whale, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the unit. I want to thank Pumla for putting together this panel before she went on sabbatical, for inviting the wonderful group of panelists that we have with us today that I will be introducing to you shortly. This is new terrain for all of us, so please bear with us. I want to also thank Landi Meyering, who is our program coordinator, for doing all the background technical work in setting up this webinar. And she's also the person behind the icon, which you can't see in full, but it reads Studies in Historical Trauma and Transformation. She's the one who's been responding to your emails and will help me with the technical aspects of the webinar. So also to let you know that we are recording the webinar, and we will be hopefully posting it on our Facebook and website pages. You can also follow our Facebook page, Studies in Historical Trauma and Transformation, if you want to see the future events that we are doing. And also our website, if you want to know more about what we do at Studies in Historical Trauma and Transformation, you can visit our website. But just briefly, the work of our researchers and postgraduate students all speaks in different ways to the broad topic of histories of violence and memory in Africa. This includes work on historical and transgenerational trauma and what it means to deal with, repair, and transform these histories of violence and oppression in ways that speak to the material, political, social, and psychological challenges that confront us in today's world. So all of the webinars in our series speak to this topic, and today's event, which I'm very delighted is our first webinar event, is entitled White Work: Engaging the Violence of Racism in South Africa Today. We have a wonderful panel of 3 speakers who are all passionate, challenging, caring, and thoughtful scholar practitioners who are working to engage issues of racism from their positionalities as white South Africans, with all of the complications and challenges that that brings. And I have deep respect for all 3 of you, because you are working at the very site of where it is difficult and where it is tricky. Each of them also offers something unique to this conversation. And so we have organized the event, and I'm going to give you a little bit of what that's going to look like so you know what to expect. We will start with Melissa Steyn, who I'm going to introduce to you in a moment, not yet. And she will be presenting on her theoretical work on the ignorance contract in relation to whiteness. We will then move on to a more practical experiential case study of doing this white work in the context of the Dutch Reformed Church. And we will be hearing from Dominee or Reverend Helgard Pretorius, who's going to tell us his experiential story of what it was like to be involved in this work. And then Wilhelm Verwoerd, who will be speaking as a facilitator who was called in to help this group and reflecting on that process. And then we will bring Melissa back in to offer her reflections in dialogue with Wilhelm and Helgard. And when we were preparing for this event online, the excitement around the conversation was already building. So I'm very excited to see how it unfolds. I also really want to thank the panelists, because originally they agreed to do a seminar. And then when the situation changed and we asked them if they would be open to doing a webinar, they've agreed. And so I'm really grateful that they are testing these waters with us and willing to do that. A technical note on the question and answer session. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there will be an icon, Q&A icon. If you want to ask questions, you click on that icon and you type in your question. Please will you include your name, your affiliation, if that's relevant, where you are speaking from, which part of the world, and who the question is for. In some cases, Landy and I may ask you if you want to come on live so we connect to your audio and visual feed. Otherwise, I will read the questions out to the panelists. Okay, I think that is all the technical details covered, I hope. So I'm going to introduce all three of our speakers first, and then I will hand over to them. So with us today, we have Professor Melissa Steyn, who is a professor in the Faculty of Humanities at Wits University and the founding director of the Wits Center for Diversity Studies. She also holds a Saatchi Chair in Critical Diversity Studies, and she is author of the critically acclaimed and award-winning book, Whiteness Just Isn't What It Used to Be, White Identity in a Changing South Africa. And she has won many awards and accolades for her teaching and also her work in this area. And then we have Reverend or Dominee Helgard Pretorius, who is an ordained minister of the Dutch Reformed Church, currently in a community in Pinelands. He is a founding member of his church's task team created to address racism and promote restitution and reconciliation. He is also a PhD candidate in a joint program between Stellenbosch University and the Free University of Amsterdam. And finally, we have Wilhelm Verwoerd, who is a senior research associate and facilitator with, I'm proud to say, studies in historical trauma and transformation. He is a former researcher with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and a peace practitioner in Northern Ireland. His recently published autobiographical book entitled Verwoerd, My Journey Through Family Betrayals, focuses on what it means to be committed to real reconciliation and be the grandson of Dr. H.F. Verwoerd, known as the architect of apartheid. So, a powerful panel to be reflecting on this topic together. I will now hand over to you, Melissa, to start us off. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. So, well, first, let me just express my appreciation, Kim, for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. It's definitely my first experience of this format, so probably a learning experience for all of us, but also, you know, as I say, really a great opportunity, so thank you for that. I also want to acknowledge the work that Wilhelm and Helgard are doing in this area. I think their work on white work, the engagement with white people in trying to deconstruct their understandings of themselves and of our history is obviously quite a lot closer to practice than the work that I do, which is obviously more grounded in research. And so I'm hoping that the two different angles from which we come are going to, you know, work together and create a nice complex discussion for us and more rounded discussion. So what I'm planning to do is to concentrate and make a few comments on this notion of the ignorance contract, which I have been developing over a number of years, and also refer to some research that I've been doing on white South Africans who lived through a significant period of apartheid, or a significant period of their lives during apartheid, who have been prepared to be interviewed or participate in focus groups, talking about what I like to call what we knew. So actually trying to get through the questions of ignorance and knowledge through the period of apartheid. And you know, that's, I think it's really interesting work, because obviously we all know that post-apartheid, very few people are prepared to actually acknowledge that we did know. The dominant discourse amongst white South Africans is that we didn't know for various reasons. We, talk about media censorship and government control of information, obviously the ways in which we were segregated, and we perpetuate this notion that it wasn't possible for us to actually understand the realities of apartheid life. And in that way, trying to construct, as it were, an innocent subjectivity for ourselves. So I've been very grateful to the people who've participated in this study, because I think it does take quite a lot of courage to acknowledge oneself as being part of a perpetrator group, and to try to explore what that actually means in terms of one's own implications in a system of oppression. And then I've also obviously asked them to reflect on how, this is carried through to today, and how they still feel that some of these dynamics are being continued into our current situation. So first, I just want to say something about ignorance itself. Anybody who's done any kind of work or had any engagement with critical whiteness studies will know that this is always theorized as being right at the center of the positionality that we could call whiteness. This fact that white people generally and in an ongoing way tend to think that race is something that affects Black people, and that the problems of race are to be found amongst Black communities, and that in some ways they aren't implicated. White people aren't implicated in constructing the racial order. So I think the person who has written most trenchantly on this is Charles W. Mills, who wrote a wonderful book on the racial contract. And he argues that while we think of a social contract as being the foundations of the modern world order, a particular kind of social contract, he argues that it is truer to acknowledge that this contract was actually a racial contract. It was an agreement, as it were, amongst the white people of the Northern Hemisphere to construct a world that they buy into, that meets their group interests, their social interests, and that actually was never really meant to include Black people. So Charles Mills says that on matters related to race, this racial contract prescribes for its signatories an inverted epistemology, an epistemology of ignorance, producing the ironic outcome that whites will in general be unable to understand the world they themselves have made. And I think this is quite an extraordinary insight, that in general, white people, although they have been the people with the agency that has created the kinds of social, economic realities of the modern world, generally don't understand the world that they have created, and generally have very little insight into how it really has operated for people who've been on the receiving end, the people who've been constructed as the others of this world. So working from that understanding, I think that we can see the ignorance contract as the kind of buy-in that white people give to a system that enables their own self-management at a collective level in such a way that they can retain a positive self-regard for themselves, while at the same time maintaining and receiving the ill-gotten gains of oppression of others. And I think that the important point about the ignorance contract then is that one's able, if one is ignorant of the realities of the lives of the people who are being oppressed by the system that you put in place, you are able to take the good life and not think about it. And but it does require, and this is important, it does require consent to this racial order, and that's where the contract comes in. We have to agree to maintain that ignorance. The ignorance then provides a kind of an insulating medium that allows the hierarchy to reproduce itself. We don't. It's like we don't have to cross that insulating barrier between the white world that the beneficiaries exist in and the black world that is being created by the mechanisms that we ourselves are putting into place. So that the white world, if you like, can exist in a way in parallel to the world that we are creating for others. And I think this is really, really important because it is a kind of a contract, and I think it's important to recognize that it does require a certain kind of buy-in. And that in itself is not just about developing kind of cognitive ways of being that involve denial, that involve misrepresentations, but it really is about the whole shaping of the whole subjectivity of, like, the white child through socialization that enables one to live with not knowing about the realities of other people. So it's a whole way of organizing a person's affect, your feelings, but also obviously your sense of ethics. And all of this suggests that living in this within this ignorant contract is quite a complex state of being that really requires a commitment to the social group's interests. In particular, a denial of one's relationality towards with Black people, and really an insulation from their realities. And I think what's important here is also to recognize that this kind of ignorance is not just an absence of knowledge. It's actually a social achievement. It's a social achievement in the same kind of order as our creating knowledge through the way in which we circulate ideas, thoughts, understandings about who we are, and this, and constructing an epistemology of ignorance requires that same kind of social investment and that same kind of work within whiteness. And so, as I say, it's a social accomplishment. It's not just an empty space. It's also full of all sorts of kinds of misrepresentations about the other, false knowledges about the other that provide us with a sense that we actually really do know, if we think of the kinds of stereotypes and things that are perpetuated about Black people in order to create that world of whiteness that thinks that it is able to, to proclaim about all peoples and speak about their conditions with a sense of authority without actually really being in touch with the worlds of others. So I think the important thing that comes up for me, and I want to stress this, is what I feel is something that's probably lacking in a lot of the white work that's been done. I think 20, 30 years ago when critical whiteness studies first started, the the recognition of our privilege was quite a breakthrough, you know, for people to be able to understand that that our whiteness is framed through privilege, and that privilege is exactly what enables us to cultivate ignorance and to cultivate blindness. And so for a long time, there's been this tendency that when we do white work, the first thing we say is sort of like, I know I'm white, I know I'm privileged, you know, I understand this, and you know, that almost like a confessional moment where we acknowledge that recognition of privilege. I think it has been important. I think it's been important as a first step within the work that we need to develop cognizance and insight into our whiteness. But I think that in some ways it's not enough. I think we've remained stuck in that space for far too long. And I'm sure that is still true for an individual person's journey, that, you know, it is a necessary first stage, as it were, for us in understanding what whiteness means, is to recognize that it is the space of privilege, and that it carries blindnesses by virtue of the fact that there's you know, it's a space in which we don't actually need to know the realities of others, and where we conscious, well, perhaps not consciously, it's a mixture of sort of conscious and unconscious desires, where we create, where we do create this deliberate not knowing. So I think that's an important first step, but I think that there's a way in which white work has really got stuck at that level. And what I think is needed, and, you know, here I can also speak just in terms of my own sort of growth process in this work, is to really confront and engage with what is reality, if this is an inverted epistemology, if it has produced, as Charles Mills says, an ironic outcome that we're unable to understand the world that we have created. I think that the important thing we really need to do, if we're wanting to break the grip of whiteness on our subjectivities, is we need to make the effort and to engage imaginatively and empathetically with the world that we have created for Black people. I think that is the crucial next step that I don't really see in much white work. And the truth is that is a world that is filled with pain, with suffering, with degradation, and with terror. I don't think that we sufficiently, in the white work that we do, engage with what does it mean to be Black in a world that has been constructed as fundamentally anti-Black. What does that actually mean? What is that reality for people who are living within the spaces that have been created for Blackness by whiteness? So I think the next logical step that the ignorance contract asks of us, it's really the so what question. So what? Okay, so if we're ignorant, all right, and we can talk about, yeah, we're ignorant, and go around in these, you know, in these sort of almost solipsistic sort of conversations that remain confined with within white understandings, and in many ways then actually like reproduce whiteness. I think that it's really, really important that we take seriously and that we engage at a gut level with what does it really mean to be Black in a world that has been constructed as fundamentally anti-Black. What is it that we don't want to know? So what I have found in doing this work on what we knew is that people will admit readily to having known things like, you know, they knew that the police and the army were all around, you know, they knew about pass laws, they knew about the servants that were working in their house. They knew about spatial segregation, about segregated buses, and, you know, even violence, the fact that the law would always protect them, the law was on their side. These things they knew. But where they tell me that, you know, the ignorance really stepped in was in getting to understand the suffering of Black people, to really take that on board. And many of them talk about really not wanting to know that, not wanting to get in touch with that because of the implication of what it meant about their own humanity, or rather their own inhumanity. The fact that it meant that there was actually a choice not to know, that there was a choice not to go there. And this is really, I mean, you know, people who talk about, for example, what on earth did it mean about me that I actually wanted to go to the army? You know, what was that about? What does that say about me as a human being? That I signed up for that. I wanted to go into the army, and I knew I was being trained to kill Black people in order to perpetuate a white supremacist society. So that's that deep understanding. If we can really grapple with that, you know, the fact that we've created a world that in which when Black people say to us, you know, I can't breathe, we can't breathe. What is that? You know, what is that world? You know, and how could we actually live with constructing a world like that? And I think that it's deeply disturbing to have to really recognize that, you know, as white people since the Enlightenment period, we've defined the human, and have felt that we in some ways embody the best of the human. This is the way that we've controlled the whole rest of the world by this construction of the human, and everybody else. No, you know, we're the epitome of what it means to be human, and everybody else is constructed as being in some ways in deficit in their humanity in relation to us, and these processes of dehumanization of other people. And I think it really is profoundly disturbing of I'd say our mental health, you know, to actually have to acknowledge our implication in creating what is really an intolerable world for other people. But I suppose I'm really just throwing that out as a challenge to white work. I think the field of critical whiteness studies itself has fallen into this trap where people are writing about whiteness in a way that, you know, it's a self-generating, you know, sort of, it's invested in its own reproduction. But I think that critical step, which is really the true challenge to deconstructing our whiteness, is very seldom taken. So we're expanding the field. We're talking about, you know, we're talking about ignorance. We're talking about white fragility. We're talking about shame. We're talking about, so we're expanding our understanding of what whiteness is. But essentially, it's happening without that deep engagement of what is the world that we have created for the people who are on the other side of the system. So I think, yeah, I'm going to leave it at that, Kim. I mean, I think that to me, it's a really crucial step, and I really do speak from personal experience here, because I know that has not been at the center of my own understanding of whiteness work, and I must have been part of, helping to reproduce white work in a way that has not gone there, and it actually, for me personally, took another period of trauma. Apart from the first stuff that sort of got me aware of whiteness, and that in itself was quite an identity crisis. But it really did take me to be pushed really into quite a space of deep disturbance and deep destabilization, to be able to recognize that actually it is this. We have to get in touch with the terror of what it means to be Black in a world that has been constructed for white people, by white people, and has actually created, this space of dehumanization for Black people. That space of dehumanization, I think we actually, even in our work on whiteness, we really try to avoid getting that real sense of being in a relationship with that. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Melissa, thank you so much. I'm very, very excited to hear that we are attempting to think beyond what we've produced so far in whiteness studies. And whenever I listen to you, I always learn so much, because there is an invitational feel to what you share. So just as it's very challenging, there's a lot of compassion, and a sense that the journey is long and difficult, and sometimes happens through moments of crisis, and the capacity to face those, to think beyond where we're currently stuck. Yeah. So on that note, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Helgard and Wihelm, who will be talking about the actual experience of what it means to do this kind of work. So over to you.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you to everybody who has tuned in to listen to us. And thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you, Melissa, for what you just shared with us. Especially the very strong challenge you're posing to us, the invitation you're extending. And what I would like to share in my contribution is something like a case study, sharing just some of the work that we've tried to do, me and a couple of my colleagues within our church. And we're so grateful for this opportunity, because we're really early in our process, and we've started something. It is far from perfect. It is inadequate, and so we appreciate this opportunity to reflect on what it is that we're doing and what are possible blind spots. And so we also like to invite questions from the audience, to kind of help us better understand what it is that we are already doing, but also what do we still need to, what do we need to pay more attention to, and what do we need to focus on. So let me share with you, let me begin with where it all started. In 2015, with the Fordist movements, this really, I think, shook a lot of us to the core, especially myself and many of my colleagues, because I think to latch on to what Melissa was just saying, I think it kind of really confronted us with our own ignorance of what people are really experiencing and what life is like. So it's almost as if there was a fracture in a lot of this, a lot of the experience of Black people that we've kind of tried to hide from ourselves was suddenly out in the open, and it confronted us, and we did feel extremely disturbed by that. I think to speak from my own place, I was aware that the Dutch Reformed Church, especially that I am a part of, is deeply implicated in a lot of the damage that we see in our society. Having conceived of and legitimized and enforced apartheid, and in many ways still being an enclave in which apartheid is being perpetuated. But I think that Fordist movement really kind of gave new impetus for the urgency of what this work, how important it is, and it was almost like a catalyst for us. And it also revealed to us how deeply inadequate we are at responding to this. So we knew we needed to do something, but we had no clue how, and we didn't feel equipped to do this. And so after running short in trying to find guidance from church leadership and from our own church's institutional structures, one of my colleagues, Jacob Goethe, approached Wilhelm Verwoerd, Adam Story, and Teresa Edelman. And these were people that I think yeah.
I'm so sorry to stop you. Your sound is breaking up a little bit, and we really want to hear what you have to say. I just wonder if there's a way that we could just improve the sound slightly.
Let me see. What does it sound? Is it too soft?
You're sounding much better now.
Okay.
It's almost just breaking up. It's cutting in and out. Maybe if you could disconnect from other things. I apologize to the audience for the technical challenges. Maybe if you could disconnect any other devices that may be taking the Wi-Fi.
Okay. Let me just see. I don't have anything else. I don't know if
you are sounding much better.
Is it better now? Okay. Let's see.
Yeah. So let's see. Okay.
Okay. Thank you for interrupting me. Yeah. So they approached people that they thought might be able to serve as mentors to guide us along this work with this work, and the question that we posed to them was, can you help us help our congregations? Because we really believed that they were the problem and we needed to offer some type of solution. And their response actually really surprised us. They said, no, you cannot take other people on a journey that you're not prepared to take yourself. Begin by confronting your own privilege, begin by confronting your own whiteness, by confronting your own racism. And this then led to a process that we came to call white work. And I'll try to give a brief definition of white work, but hopefully as I start telling the story, something of what that means will become a bit more clear. So we define it as the development of a self-critical historical consciousness that is focused on restitution, as opposed to simply being about reconciliation. So I think we were challenged by the Fordist movement, especially, that the kind of rainbow nation dream can no longer exist if it isn't deeply rooted in restitution. And then also a willingness to address the persistence of power and privilege that accompanies being white in South Africa on a personal level, but also institutionally. So the first important event that took place was at the beginning of 2018. We took this challenge very seriously, that we needed to begin with ourselves. And so Yaku gathered up 12 of us, we all white Afrikaner religious leaders within the Dutch Reformed Church. And we went on a 3-day residential retreat at a camping site in Merto, Cape Town. And the retreat was facilitated by Wilhelm Verwoerd, Adam Story, and Teresa Edelman. And they're really people who are experienced facilitators. And I think Wilhelm will say that more from a facilitator's vantage point after I've shared my story.
Just quickly once more, because I'm getting lots of help from the audience. two things that will help a bit, and you are coming through much clearer. One is just speaking a little slower and perhaps turning your camera off. It is lovely to see you, but
Okay.
we really want to hear the story, and I think then we'll be sorted. I won't interrupt again. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Let me try that. Okay, there we go. So maybe some of you might be thinking, okay, wait a minute, what did you do? Are you seriously telling us that, you know, a bunch of white Afrikaners go camping together and somehow you expect that to make a difference? You know, isn't that what you do when you go on holiday? Anyway, in any case, but this was definitely not a holiday, and I think, but nevertheless, that's a very legitimate concern. So let me first say that the point of retreating in this way was definitely shouldn't be seen as a means to an end. It should be seen as a means to an end and not as an end in itself. And there is great risk in doing something like this. The pitfalls of this approach, you know, is that it could become just a way of recensoring our whiteness in a new situation. And this remains a very real danger. And so the way that we like to think of this kind of single identity work is almost as one tool within a kind of expansive toolkit, and that one actually needs in order to confront the violence of racism. And it's a good place to begin the journey, but ultimately the building of real, mutual and just relationships across race, and the transformation of institutional racism, that remains the goal. And I think very helpfully, I think what Melissa just said about going beyond simply recognizing one's own privilege and moving beyond that and trying to come to a real sense of what the world is like for Black people. That might be kind of where we're headed. So let me share something about what we did at Noordhoek. This is our first event. The main focus and activity of that retreat was that we did a storytelling exercise. And through this exercise, we tried to emphasize, and each in our telling of our own personal narratives, try to focus on the experiences and the persons in our growing up that really shaped our self-understanding and our identity as white people. In other words, each of us had to kind of tell the story of how we became white. And in this process, we shared some very painful memories. We shared many covered over truths. We confessed guilt. We expressed shame. We also articulated a sense of loss as we realized just how profoundly our racialized existence as white people meant also a loss of our own true humanity. You know, even if you can never compare the loss that we face as white people with the countless losses of Black people, this was still something important to acknowledge. And our stories also gave rise to very powerful emotions. There were also feelings of anger, disappointment and betrayal, and these were often directed at an older generation. So many of us are under the age of 40, so I was born in 1988, it was towards the end of apartheid. And, you know, this experience of being implicated in apartheid, but also inheriting something from an older generation and telling the story and recognizing in what ways our upbringing and our socialization has really made this part of who we are. I think that also gave rise to really strong emotions as well. So the point of us gathering in this way was also to begin to educate each other and to advance a more self-critical kind of stance towards who we are, and also to ask really difficult questions towards each other about you know, our power relations, or the relationships that we already stand in, and what that means. And then this initial event gave rise to a number of other processes. So I'd like to name just a few of them. One of them was a follow-up retreat that we held in Wellington. And here we focused our attention a little bit more on being educated about race and racism, also learning some facilitation skills. And I think very importantly, we worked really hard on deepening our capacity to sit with the discomfort of powerful emotions that arise when doing this work. So for instance, the really difficult emotions that arise when I'm listening to the painful stories of Black suffering, or when I'm engaging with a fellow white person about race. How do I, when those really powerful emotions emerge, and I actually just want to flee, how do I remain in that discomfort? How do I stay there? And to cultivate that, you cannot just focus on a cognitive level. This isn't just about a kind of education program that you can roll out. It really takes time. I think that's something that we realized. It really takes a big investment. It's costly, and at that second event, we were also very privileged to have 3 experienced Black practitioners, Ayanda Nyoka, Tui Jonas, and Spiwo Kapile, and they facilitated part of that program and also shared stories with us and challenged us with really difficult questions. Let me share something about another angle in which this work took us. We realized that for this work really to bear fruit and to change the fabric of our communities in concrete ways, and actually ultimately change the reality that people have in the world, especially the reality that Black people face on a day-to-day basis. This work really, even though it must begin at a personal level, needs to become also deep work on an institutional level. And so we started initiating a process of examining the Dutch Reformed Church's institutional approach to reconciliation, which we found in many ways to be lacking. And also to lobby for institutional support like finances and facilities and so forth. And so far the church leadership has been very supportive, and we've launched a provincial task team created to address racism and continue this white work. And the white work process that we're busy developing, the first 2 events that I mentioned have already become recognized as part of our continuous employee training program for pastors. And we have also conducted pilots with students preparing for the ministry in the hope that very soon this would become a compulsory part of the formal training of all prospective ministers. And since 2018, about 40 pastors have begun with this white work journey. At first, the focus was on the younger generation, but since 2019, we've also included an older generation of participants. And we're very encouraged that this year, 2 of the first participants of the process, Bianca Boerta and Louis van der Riet, also acted as co-facilitators, working with the people coming into the process anew. And so we're hoping that by cultivating this type of historical, critical racial awareness in religious leaders of local communities, and equipping them to continue this work among their congregants, that this would begin to have some type of concrete impact, not just on the church itself, but also facilitating some real change within communities. Now, in conclusion, I just want to share try to link up a little bit with how I see this work actually, what is it actually doing? What does this white work really do? And here I want to link up with Melissa's concept of the ignorance contract that she helped us with earlier in her presentation. A friend of one of our colleagues, Wilhelm, started reflecting on, just this question: what is this white work actually doing? And he very helpfully kind of helped us understand that in some way what we were doing is we were gathering as a group of people and asking each other, how can we repudiate this contract that we have all actually bought into? And this isn't an obvious, I think, thing to do, because how does a white person who has been enculturated and socialized into this whiteness, this ignorance contract, how do they actually break it? Where do they find the encouragement and the guidance, the support to actually breach this contract? And I think he noticed that, very importantly, we cannot burden black people with this responsibility. And likewise, we often experience so much and such strong resistance from white brothers and sisters, because they are, just like us, blind adherents to this contract. And so they struggle to help us. So the experience you get when you start to open up this conversation, when you start to be honest about what the world is that we have created, the resistance is sometimes so strong. And so by withdrawing in a way and creating a space in which we could really do something quite dangerous, which is to break this contract, we were able to, in some way, actually create a new contract, starting with a small group of white people. And this then becomes a subversive contract that is in clear violation of the stipulations spelled out by the ignorance contract. And Wimke is a lawyer, and he has listed some of the terms of this new contract, and I'd like to just read them to you. He says, "We agreed that the ignorance contract is unlawful and not legally binding on us. We then covenanted with each other to search for truth beyond the comfortable truths sustained by the ignorance contract. So a truth beyond the stories that we tell each other to smooth over what is really going on. We then agreed to verbalize the previously inadmissible feelings of shame, loss, anger, and disappointment. And then we promised to stand in solidarity and support each other in this continuing endeavor." Now, in no way does this mean that when we return from our retreat, the ignorance contract is completely null and void everywhere we go. In fact, we return to a world in which this ignorance contract is very much alive and kicking. But we have now become subversives, and the ignorance contract no longer has the final word, and we can find creative ways in which to challenge it and to create more pockets of people that are willing to take the plunge and break the contract and form new forms of commitment with each other and beyond. So let me end with just one kind of very practical way in which I think this might actually make a difference. And I want to latch on to what's happening at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic. And in many ways, it has really accentuated the deep, deep injustices that are at play in our society. And one of the ways in which our church has responded is by offering a lot of support through charities, reaching out to people in need, offering emergency assistance by, for instance, food distribution and so on. But we should be very, very careful about what this actually could mean in the long run. Because this could actually become another way of just reinforcing existing very harmful power dynamics that have for a very long time been at play. Our church has a strong tradition of reaching out. But we fear that if this isn't supplemented with really reaching in and transforming our own institution on a deep level, but also becoming involved in real, deep, costly attempts to make restitution for the damage caused by apartheid on the long term, then actually all of this white work, we could just as well throw it out of the window. Then it doesn't actually mean anything. So I think one way in which it challenges us is to go through this crisis and the period after that with a really critical historical consciousness that becomes involved in kind of real restitution and real change in society, rather than kind of the charity work in which we are always going out and being the heroes. And I think that something of that charity work, which is so necessary at the moment, people shouldn't stop doing it. But the danger is that that becomes another narrative that's simply a part of the ignorance contract and hides, in a way, the kind of deep inequalities that we have created and that we have a responsibility to try and unmake. So at this point, I think that's where I will leave us and pass on to Wilhelm.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and Melissa and Helgard and Kim. I'll try and keep it short because I'm conscious that many people might want to ask questions, and I think there's a strong connection already being made between the work we do and what Melissa has said. Let me just give a little bit of an international reference point. I mean, the reason why I think I was relatively comfortable to accept that invitation to become involved with this initiative with younger people within this particular community was because in the Northern Irish context, over a number of years, I became used to this language of single identity work as a preparation to get to cross-community work. And that wasn't language that was used in South Africa when I returned about 7 years ago. I think we are very uncomfortable with anything that smells of separatist little groups doing their thing and essentializing differences between people. But I think it was helpful to have that international framework to say that in other places, people have found it very helpful if you want to prepare people to go into these very difficult, challenging, racially charged spaces, to have some kind of preparation process. And I think that for me is what white work is trying to contribute to. I also found in Israel and Palestine that people were not only using what they call uninational kind of processes in preparation for binational processes. They were not only using it as preparation, but also during actual binational engagements between Israelis and Palestinians. So you would have an engagement of people coming together, challenging each other around all the big issues that they are facing. And then within a process, there are spaces for people to go into like a Hebrew speaking or an Arabic speaking group and to digest and work through and question each other and then come back into the joint spaces. So those two experiences, I think, have encouraged me to experiment with a younger generation of people. How can we be creative with processes in South Africa that when we talk about race or reconciliation or humanization, we don't only assume the only way is to bring people all together in the same space. And that actually we can damage the process if we don't do the preparation and if we're not more creative with the kind of facilitated processes that I think we can also learn from other places. So that's the first point, just to bear that in mind. And I don't know, Melissa, in terms of the point you made about the gap in critical whiteness studies, where the part of that unwillingness to go to that next step is the absence of facilitated processes that actually prepare people to go into those spaces of deep, painful empathy and spaces to work through that in a way that then can go back into reflective kind of intellectual work. That's just as an aside. The second point, I just want to again draw on the facilitation experience to perhaps just in a very simplistic way, but just give 4 ways in which I think white work can make a contribution. And in our work, we often took groups of people from different backgrounds in the Northern Irish conflict. We took them into the Scottish Highlands. We took them into the Wihelm Mountains. We even brought them to South Africa. And we would go on a wilderness trail for 5 days to really take people out of their comfort zone and have time to work through these big issues. But what I have found was that you cannot take people on these extended journeys if they underestimate the risks, the pitfalls, if there's an unawareness about what this work involves. So we had to do preparation work. You also cannot take people into the mountains or into the wilderness if they're not fit. Like if they're actually not physically, psychologically prepared. So there's a fitness issue. I think white fragility, white stamina, that's the language people use. Then there's also a question around when people come on these journeys, they come with old injuries. I mean, we had people who had a leg blown off by this bomb and another person's arm, you know, blown off by a mortar attack. I mean, physical injuries that people bring to these processes. And they complicate, if you want to deal with, say, for example, issues of poverty, inequality, injustice. People come with their memories and their injuries and their issues. And I think it has come up very strongly in the white work that there's lots of issues around the so-called border war and militarized masculinity that complicates racial dynamics, but we don't have a space to work through that, and it complicates the process. And then the 4th reason why I think white work can make a contribution is that you cannot, you know, climb a mountain or go on these trails on your own. You need to have support. You need to have people with you. So you need to have an awareness. You need to be fit. You need to have spaces to work through the injuries that you come with, the old stuff that you carry, and you need to have support systems in place. And I think in all 4 those ways, sensitive white work can be preparation for meaningful, deep racial reconciliation. Let me just conclude by saying that in our own attempt to frame what we do, we have found it quite helpful to draw on the integral theory of Ken Wilber. And also you might even think of the Benedictine monastic tradition with their idea of ora et labora, this idea of, you know, you've got to pray and you've got to work, but you've got to do that individually and you've got to do that collectively. So if you imagine in front of you this a kind of a cross, and since we're using a church-based case study, let's just use the example of a cross and not look at the Christian symbolism, but let's look at the 4 quadrants that are actually produced when you draw a cross. And that if you look on the left-hand side, you basically have a kind of an inner focus, and on the right-hand side, a kind of outer focus. And then the top half of the top quadrants would be the kind of individual focus, and the bottom quadrants would be the collective focus. So you end up with these 4 quadrants. And it feels to me, and it seems to me, that unless we address all 4, we cannot have this kind of meaningful reconciliation processes. So there's a intrapersonal kind of individualized experience that people bring to what it means to be white. And that's why we use that kind of storytelling. And we need to find ways for each person to tell their own unique story of their experience of being white. And I'm just using whiteness now as the example. We need to look at how that individual person can actually enact that awareness in their real life. So it's got to have an outer individual dimension. But then we come to the critical part, and I think that's where a lot of churchy stuff often goes wrong, is that we do not look at the collective. And we do not look at the very obvious ways in which my whiteness is shaped by the culture, by the language, by the religion, by the, you know, socialization that I bring, and that those issues need to be addressed and changed. So that's the bottom, you know, inner quadrant, and then your bottom outer quadrant would be the socioeconomic manifestations of whiteness. And so that we are very clear that unless we as individuals do the work we need to do, but we do that together so that we come to the values, the assumptions, the fears, the prejudices, but we have to also address the socioeconomic realities. And I think this is where the current crisis really helps us to make visible the very glaring inequalities and the racialized poverty that's haunting us. And that as white South Africans, especially in the Dutch Reformed Church, with all the responsibility we carry for the past, we need to find ways to practically engage with the inequalities. Unless we do that, you know, all this other work becomes questionable. And I'm grateful that there are, I mean, basically, I'm very encouraged by the fact that there's a younger generation that I can work with. I'm encouraged by what's possible with a network across the country. I'm also aware that there are people in, for example, Gauteng. I'm thinking of a group that call themselves the Beter Einders, better end instead of bitter Einders. So it's like a better ender instead of a bitter ender, which has an Afrikaner kind of historical ring to it. But they've already done a lot of work also on how do we go from the white work into the actual socioeconomic realities and address dehumanizing poverty. And there are these pockets of people also in Port Elizabeth and in Bloemfontein. So the idea of a kind of a network across the country of people working together to address these issues, for me, is why I am involved in this particular project. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Helgard and Wilhelm. And I want to give Melissa a chance now to reflect on what she's heard or ask questions to the both of you. So Melissa, remember to unmute your mic before you go on.
Okay, am I audible again? Okay. So, you know what, it's really difficult for me to think of how to respond to such a rich contributions from both of Wilhelm and Helgard. So perhaps I can just say one or two things. You know, I think the question of facilitation is always just something that is so sensitive in the way in which we lead people through these processes. Because I think that if the processes aren't challenging enough, you know, people remain in their comfort zones and they're not going to really make any change. So obviously there has to be the creation of some sort of sense of urgency around this. And I think that has been probably the greatest missing factor amongst white South Africans, is that when I think around about 90, in the early 90s, 94, I used to belong to an organization that was something about conflict and mediation. I can't remember its exact name now. And at the end of 1993, they had a conference in Durban, and there was no space. Honestly, you could hardly find standing space. There was so much interest. I went overseas 1994. I came back 1996, and I went to the next one in 1997, and I think there were 12 people. You know, and that has really, to me, been such an indication of how, you know, in the run up to the political change of 1994, white people had a real sense that there was stuff that they better learn and that they better get their heads around, you know. And then after 1994, there was this huge drop in terms of that sense. It's like, oh, well, now we can relax again. You know, it's all been sorted. And I think that if we are going to do personal change, we do need a sense of urgency. We need a sense of understanding why this stuff really matters and why our own skin is in this. It's not just for other people, but it's actually, you know, our own selves that need to do this. As we do it for ourselves, you know. But obviously, if there's too much anxiety created within these spaces, then people leave. I mean, you know, not just like immigration, but psychologically, they also leave. So somehow for people who are facilitating this, I think it's a really difficult kind of balance to hold, that right sense of creating the right amount of anxiety, but not too much of it, you know. And so I salute you for being, you know, right there doing that kind of work. And then I also want to say, you know, this question that I actually saw in the question and answer column, you know, is this for everybody? You know, well, I think we are all on, you know, different learning trajectories, different stages of our learning, but I think It has to be for everybody. But I do think that Carl Jung was right when he said that in any generation, it's actually a small group of people who carry consciousness for that generation. So I think there's an important role for leadership here amongst white South Africans, one that actually I think is very thin on the ground. You know, the kind of work that we're hearing from Helgard and Wilhelm is actually really, you know, sorely needed, and there's not nearly enough of it. But people who have felt the urgency, who have taken themselves deeper into these issues, really do have a very important leadership role to play in helping to create more of a sense of urgency amongst other white South Africans. I think there's also questions around, I think also perhaps just understanding that, you know, we're making this path as we walk it. It's not as if we have models of how people actually really have changed the racial order anywhere. You know, this is an order that's been, you know, it's half a millennium old, and it's global in its reach. And we've never had a globally interconnected world that has not been shaped through racism and through the ignorance contract. So I think we also have to recognize that we don't have formulas, and we are ourselves, along with the people who also want to do this kind of work. We're creating it. We're creating it as we go along, which I think also means that we have to have a little bit of compassion for ourselves if we don't always get it right. But also that, yeah, you know, this is important learning for all of us as we do the work. And I think there was an important question that Helgard framed around, you know, firstly, let me say that I'm really excited by the way in which the ignorance contract is being picked up in the work that you're doing. And I think that, I think it's groundbreaking. I have to tell you, I really do. I think that idea of creating an alternative contract that, you know, that deliberately takes on the ignorance contract, deliberately and consciously, and you know, tries to create a different, you know, a way in which white people can consciously and deliberately work in the way against the whiteness contract. But I think that's terrifically powerful, and I have to tell you, I've not seen it anywhere else. I think, you know, I still do believe that South Africa really can create very cutting edge, very leading edge work in this field, and I do think that you know, it's more powerful than anything I've read about in white work. So I'm just really so excited, and I really hope you're going to continue with that. But I do also want to say that, yeah, I completely agree about the 4 quadrants, and that this is individual work, but that we cannot do it on our own. Individuals cannot do it on their own. And so this idea of sort of forming collectives that work consciously with a different contract, I think is terribly powerful. But having said that we can't do it on our own, I think another thing that comes through quite clearly is that we can't depend on Black people to do it for white people. I mean, I'm always struck, you know, if one works within organizations and things, it always comes up that some white person's going to say to you, so, well, what must I do? You know? they sort of pose this question to black people, like, you know, well, what must I do? And in a way, that's a passive aggression move, a passive aggressive mood, sort of saying, you know, well, you know, I'll be stuck and I'll leave you to unstuck me. You know, it's, you know, so that there's sort of like a kind of a feigned helplessness, if I can call it that, because I think that there is so much we can do as individuals, and there is so much material on the internet, in books. You know, it's almost ubiquitous. If you want to understand whiteness, if you want to understand racial formations, if you want to understand, you know, black realities, there is so much. And I think that, you know, we have to also encourage people and challenge people to also do their own work, you know, to take responsibility and, you know, to get on with it on their own too. You know, in earlier work that I did in the book, I speculated, because it was in early days of the changeover, shortly post 1994, and it seemed to me that, you know, the different kinds of options that are left for whiteness is whiteness can formulate itself in a context where it's lost the political and state power. It can formulate itself as resistance, and I think we see a lot of that, you know, whiteness as resistance. But the other choice is whiteness as supportive formation. And so the danger, Helgard, that you refer to about co-option is always there. You know, that whatever we work in this field can always be co-opted into the dominant whiteness, and actually become yet another form of evasion, you know. But I think it's important then for us to be very clear that we are repositioning whiteness as supportive of the main narrative of post-apartheid South Africa, which is the empowering of black people, the undoing of the injustices, and the restitution of black people. And when we understand that, there's such a big difference between sort of like, you know, positioning oneself as the distributor of largesse, you know, out of the goodness of our whiteness, you know, and actually really, really rethinking ourselves as people who are positioned to be supportive to the historical gift that we have been given, which is the opportunity to help, to be part of turning around this great injustice that has been done in our name, you know. And I think so it's very much just, you know, how we understand our positionality as whiteness, because, you know, in South Africa, I think we really do have an opportunity to wield whiteness to be supportive as opposed to be dominating. You know, I think that that's important. Listen, I mean, I can say a lot more, but I think I'll leave it like that at that, Kim, because I'm sure you want to include the people who have raised issues. I could also just say that I think the intergenerational stuff is also really, really important. I'm so reminded of the man, and I'm forgetting his name, who wrote that book about Bootman. You know, I don't know if
Chris Steyn?
Chris Lowe, I guess.
Chris Lowe, that's right, you know, and who actually committed suicide. You know, I think that burden, and he articulated so painfully that sense of betrayal that he felt by the older generation of Afrikaans men, you know, who had sent the younger generation to a war that could not be won. And yes, that's it. Yeah. I remember where he says, Bootman is in Muran, you know. But I mean, I think that's, you know, there's intergenerational things and the kinds of things, Wilhelm, that you talk about with the military wounds. I mean, these are things that, you know, we have to really grapple with in these spaces that we work with, but always being aware of how those can again become deflections where we're doing that kind of Me Tooism, as opposed to actually dealing with the issue of you know, grappling with our deep lack of relationality with blackness and with what whiteness has constructed.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and all of our speakers. I see there are quite a few questions. I have been trying to listen, so I haven't had a chance to properly look through the questions. I'm going to open them up now. We had hoped to have some questions go live, but I think because we've got about 25 minutes and I want us to get to as many questions as we can, I'm rather just going to read the questions. So I'm going to start. Okay, maybe I should start from the top. So Melissa, there was a question from Andre Vestra from Strand, and any of you can answer these questions. Let me choose 5 for now, and then I'll put it to you. And we were just speaking about intergenerational differences. Are there generational differences in the ignorance contracts?
Yes.
And how do these present in behavior? Let me go through 5 if that's okay. And then I wanted to also speak to Jamil Khan's question. Melissa, I think he's from,
yes.
I think Jamil's from WITS, a Center
yes,
for Diversity
PhD
Studies.
student. Yeah.
Yes, and we actually wanted Jamil to come on live, but I think just for time purposes, I'm gonna read the question. So he says, Melissa, I've been ruminating on the reality that many of us, especially in South Africa, actually hate white people. But we are desperately trying not to succumb to such a toxic state of being. To talk about whiteness as a Black person is to endure constant gaslighting. Listening to you talk about ill-gotten gains made me look at each of the speakers' backgrounds, and it is clear to see that everyone is living in privilege. How do you personally reconcile living in privilege while deconstructing its effects? Where does the theory end and the practice start? With an extreme scenario of immediately inverting the hierarchy of humanity is not ideal, not practical. I think that's a very, very powerful question, and I think it reflects an important issue that we need to respond to. So I wonder if we actually stop there, respond, and then I'll move on to more questions.
Jamil, you would of course ask a question that is almost impossible for me to answer. Jamil has always done that. So, Jamil, I mean, you know, I want to say that in any of this kind of work, there's no pure space from which we can respond. You know, humanity, the way in which society gets constructed is that we're all, you know, implicated, and we all are in some ways recipients of things that we don't deserve, or we're you know, we have thoughts or feelings that are not pure, you know. So I think that one of the things that is necessary for us to take on in this work is that if we waited for when we were in a space where we could act without any personal contradiction, we'd never do anything. And so we do have to start with the understanding that yes, we're implicated, we're contaminated, but we still have to do important work. So I mean, the question of Black people hating white people, of course, there's a way in which, as a white person, one continues to hope that we can, in some ways, you know, respond and behave in such a way that that our you know, our integrity in what we're doing can become visible. But I don't think that we can wait for that before we do the work that is historically incumbent upon us to do. I think, you know, the living in privilege, I think that, you know, we honestly have to take that on as a real question for white people in this country. And I think one of the most important ways in which we can do things like that is, for example, just to think about things like our wills. You know, what do we do with our intergenerational wealth? You know, do we pass like that wealth on to our children and only to our children, or do we think about how do we use that to help to you know, improve things in a way that is reconstructive. So I think there are many ways. I mean, I just know for myself, I'm constantly questioning myself on how can I redistribute my, you know, ill-gotten gains in ways that, you know, obviously, I don't want to live in discomfort, but there are definitely things that I can do, and I don't feel like I've really done anything until it does pinch me a bit. If I don't feel it, you know, but we've got a long road ahead. You know, we've got a long road ahead. There's a lot that we're going to be dealing with, and I suppose we'll have to see how we manage to work this through in time to come. I don't think that there are any easy answers, and I don't think that we have the moral high ground to demand of Black people to be kind to us as we struggle with this stuff.
Thanks, Wilhelm. Thanks, Melissa. Wilhelm or Helgard, would you like to also respond? Or?
Let me just say briefly, thank you for that, Melissa. I mean, I think that the big challenge is how do we share those privileges? How do we do something with it? I think individually, but also be part of projects, institutional attempts to bring more people in, so that it's more like a movement. And I hope that some of what we do is contributing to that. I do think we have an opportunity at the moment, just talking to people and even people within this Dutch Reformed Church group, that people have a heightened sense of privilege, given what is happening with the crisis. And that it really gives us a chance to talk about what does it mean to be a beneficiary of historical, systematic, intergenerational privileging. And it makes it very accessible almost to really forefront this question of beneficiaryhood. And we have to talk about perpetrators. We have to contribute to, you know, the prosecutions that need to happen, which hasn't happened, and the kind of legal focus. But I think the bigger question is about what does it mean to be a beneficiary, and how can we use those benefits not to perpetuate, but to transform. And I think that's for me an urgent reality at the moment. And then just in terms of the question around intergenerational, I think for me, what has been one of the most disturbing parts of working with a younger group, mostly a younger group of people, the next generation, in terms of the white Afrikaner community. One of the most disturbing things for me has been to see how similar the childhoods of young people born after 94 or late 1980s, how similar their childhood is or was to the way mine was in the 60s and the 70s. So Jonathan Janssen's idea of knowledge in the blood, and how these systems of attitudes and narrow worldviews and the ignorance contract, how that is still transmitted in terms of the language people use, the experiences, the inequalities, the lack of genuine cross-racial relationships. So I think there's a big similarity, and then obviously there is this question of how do I deal with the anger of Helgard's generation and my children's generation towards what we have given to them. And that we have to work through those issues so that Black South Africans don't continue to pay the price for our unwillingness to actually get involved in the difficult redistribution of issues.
Yeah, I'm not going to repeat what Wilhelm and Melissa has already said, but But I think in terms of putting one's privilege to use, I think an important place is also where's the center, where does the energy come from, and where's the focus when I'm doing that? Am I doing it as a kind of from a place of guilt, which basically makes me the center of trying to kind of make myself feel better? Or, you know, am I trying to kind of avoid doing anything because I'm actually starting with my own experience? And I think a helpful kind of very practical kind of almost something challenge that we've made to each other is to try and simply place yourself in contexts and in movements, in organizations where we are not in control. So pitching up and saying, here I am to help, being very open and honest about what privileges I have. You know, I've got money, I've got an education, I've got influence, I've got a captive audience every Sunday. I don't know if they listen, but you know, they're there. You know, these are the things that I have at my disposal. Here I am, make use of me. How can I be of service? And I don't determine what that actually ends up looking like or what it ends up being. Yeah.
Okay, Kim, can I say one more thing? Can I come in again?
Yeah, we've got quite a few questions, so I
Okay.
wonder whether I should maybe read through a few and then
I'll be
respond
terribly
first,
quick.
Melissa.
Okay, I'll be
Off you
very
go.
Okay, I just want to say, and I think another important thing which is implicit in what we've been saying, is it's the importance to speak out. You know, I mean, I think, for example, when people start forming these white formations that are overtly trying to retain the white privilege and use all sorts of mechanisms of you know, presenting themselves as victims and this sort of thing, I think it's crucially important that we speak out, that we make it very clear, not in our name. You know, you're not speaking for all Afrikaners, for example. When you talk about Afrikaners as being, you know, a threatened group of people who are being subjected to genocide. So I'll just want you to add that.
Okay, thanks. So now I really will read out a few questions and then you can pick up as you want, and that will be our last round because we are coming to the end. So I'm going to start with a question that's just jumped out now from Sibusiso Maseko from the Department of Psychology at UNISA, who says that part of my PhD work focuses on collective nostalgia amongst white South Africans. I would like to get your thoughts on white South Africans and their sense of longing for the past and how this comes up in your work, Melissa, on the ignorance contract. So from there, I'm going to jump to another question, Adebayo's question, because it's on loss. So it could tie in. So Adebayo, who's from Wits, hi Adebayo. I don't know how this works, but I'll just type my question here. I'm interested in the issue of white loss. There is the assumption that when we speak about loss in post-apartheid South Africa, it is mostly about Black people. But from this webinar, I'm getting a sense that there are white losses. What does that mean for the kind of work you do? How do you negotiate that in relation to right-wing white groups that embrace victimhood, that claim that they are the real victim in post-apartheid South Africa? And the second question, whiteness is entrenched in every aspect of culture. Therefore, in undoing racism, aren't we undoing white identity? How do we then deal with that? And I'm going to go to one more question from Rebecca Freeth about solidarity, which speaks to now. So Rebecca asks, my question is about the potential for solidarity, especially at this time. Corona has the possibility to enable those with safety nets to become more cognizant of those who don't, and our sense of being together in this together. Not charity, but solidarity. As a health crisis, it also potentially reignites the conversation about how to make NHI succeed as a form of redistribution of resources. If those with privilege and wealth are going to be taxed more to enable NHI, taxpayers need to be on board. Goodwill and solidarity can be generated, especially through crisis. Any comments on specific opportunities you see now? And I wonder if I can just ask one more, and then I'll hand it over. Bronwyn Keen Young is a PhD candidate at UCT, GSB. Her dissertation is on normative whiteness in the South African workplace and how it hampers the progress of Black professionals. She says, thanks for the insightful presentations, but I'd like to know the speaker's views on the following. The white work here appears to be strongly linked to Afrikaans identity and institutions. It often seems that English-speaking whites regard racism as an Afrikaner problem, and they use that to avoid confronting their own whiteness and complicity in racism. Yet, English-speaking whiteness in South Africa is actually a manifestation of global normative whiteness, which extends well beyond South African history. We have wonderful questions. I'm going to have to stop there and hand over to you guys, so you can each get a chance to respond to those questions. Thank you for the questions.
Well, I think somebody else should go first this time.
Helgard?
I can respond to the one about loss and the undoing of white identity. I think maybe that's something I can do. Yes, so I think that this was something that I think surprised me and many of my colleagues as we were doing the work, was that as we were telling our stories, and very often it was the first time that we ever told these stories. Firstly, because white spaces are not spaces that allow me to tell that story. And as somebody who is not on the far right and trying to, kind of make myself a victim, I try to avoid telling those type of stories in a Black context. So I never did that. And this kind of space, which was facilitated, allowed me for the first time to share some of those stories. And as we were doing that, we started realizing something of what we lost. And I realized, for instance, let me say something of my own loss. To be a white person is to be a lesser person. It is to be dehumanized. It is not to be a human being. A white identity is a very narrow, constricted space in which to exist. Yes, it comes with many privileges, but it also closes me off from a broader community. I thought of many friends that I'd lost, opportunities to really connect with people across race. Something else was that I had a nanny growing up, a Black woman who lived with us in our house. And because of the very disturbing way in which that relationship was framed in our household, in which she was part of the family, but also not part of the family. It was only later that I realized the great injustice that she suffered, living in our home, not with her own children, while she was looking after us. And the restitution that lies ahead for me in terms of that relationship, but also the way in which that relationship was broken off when I left the house and she was no longer in our employment. So those are just maybe like two examples of ways in which I think the first thing is that this white identity is really not a place in which to live a life. And that relates to the second question posed by that person. Sorry, I can't remember what the name was, but
it was Adebayo.
Yes, Adebayo, yeah. Is about the restructuring of, is this a loss of white identity? And I think, yes, it is a loss of white identity, but there are much broader, richer identities to become a part of. Yeah. And I think the loss is important to recognize it, because that initial experience is really painful. It's a dying off of a certain type of identity, and it's a dying off and a letting go of very powerful attachments. And these are attachments that promise privilege. So it's also a loss of safety, security, potentially even of material security. And I think to really let go of that is a process of loss. And it takes time and it's painful. But I think what you gain out of that experience is really almost like a resurrection. It's a coming to life in new ways, and it opens you up to much richer forms of identity that can be given. So that's just a response to that question.
I mean, I'll go next quickly. Yes, I agree with what Helgard was saying. I think, I mean, obviously there's it's very uncomfortable for us to be part of this panel, and we talk about white loss, and we're conscious of so much out there, and so much of these conversations actually really can only happen across the kind of historical divisions. But I think the focus for this webinar is intra-group, white work. So it's appropriate that we focus on this. But I just want to say my discomfort to almost respond to some of the questions. But I really think that is why white work is needed, is to create those spaces where people can talk about the issues amongst themselves. And I'm more familiar with the Afrikaner community, but to talk through issues, historical issues, relationships with the dead, people who've sacrificed their lives, the conscription thing, intergenerational dynamics, all of that, I think, comes with loss. And a willingness to let go in the way that Helgard has said. And we can't ask Black South Africans or people of color to be carrying that burden, which they've been doing for a long time. And we need to do that work and be honest about it. And then having said that, I do still have, I come from a traditional Afrikaner nationalist childhood. So we grew up with strong anti-English sentiments. And one of the things that made us so angry was the moral arrogance of English-speaking South Africans and blaming the Boere for everything. And that issue is still with us. And I'm fascinated sometimes by the kind of English-speaking, Afrikaans-speaking white dynamics, again, which is something we need to sort out. It's not something, I mean, the Anglo-Boer War and the South African War, the consequences are still with us, and for the sake of white reconciliation. So I don't want to go down that route, but I am very aware that when it comes to the question of beneficiaries and the distribution of wealth and land ownership and all those big structural issues that go back to 1910 and 1912, those times, is very much part of the English-speaking community, and we need to find ways to face that, not with aggression or anger, but to really say, as white South Africans, we were systematically privileged based on the color of our skin, not our culture. And that there are lots of systematic ways in which we're all beneficiaries, and we have to take responsibility for
that. To all of this. I think I want to just pick up first with Wilhelm around the question of the Wessers, as we call them, the white English-speaking South Africans. And I think that you don't actually understand whiteness in South Africa if you don't understand that historical break between Afrikaners and English-speaking South Africans, because I think it's a different kind of configuration of whiteness than you find pretty well anywhere that I've read, about whiteness. It is different, and so you do have this thing. I mean, I always like to remember that quote from Lord Kitchener, who said that Afrikaners are savages with a thin white veneer. And I think that really puts the sort of like the English chauvinism towards Afrikaners in, a very stark kind of indisputable way. And as I think Bronwyn correctly says, the English-speaking whiteness had the whole power of the empire behind it. It was a much a more powerful version of whiteness, and it. Because of that power, in some ways, you could call it, you know, almost like the whiteness in South Africa, if you want to be controversial, which, you know, I don't really shy away from, because it was able to hide itself as normative, all right, and therefore not attract attention to itself, and then construct Afrikaners as being the real racists in our society. But actually, when you look back in history, you'll see that all the laws that were implemented under apartheid had precursors, had some sort of version beforehand. You know, all the segregationist laws had precursors in terms of, you know, segregation, in terms of you know, not allowing interracial intimacy, in controlling access cities, in creating job reservation. I mean, all those things were actually established before apartheid. And it's actually one of my pet peeves when people talk about, you know, all our problems in South Africa in terms of race as having started in 1948. I mean, it's just not true. If you really want to see like arch racism in operation, you have to look at people like Cecil John Rhodes, you know. So I think that this is something that I've often felt, particularly like working in English-speaking institutions, that English-speaking people have often not had to confront their whiteness. They've not felt the necessity to confront whiteness or to look at how they themselves are implicated in these things, because they've been able to project it onto Afrikaners, just in the same way as like middle-class professional whites can project it onto poor whites and say that they are the real racists. And I think that these are some of the issues that we really do need to, we do need to also find good ways to talk about those things. I just want to say that whole question of the losses of whiteness, I think we have to recognize that if we are grieving for losses of privileges and, you know, issues like that, we do have to recognize that what we are grieving for was illegitimate in the first place. And I think that that's an important point to put into these discussions. You know, I think we do have to challenge people to understand, yeah, maybe the grief is real, but the privileges, the ways of life, the ways of understanding yourself, that you now feeling that you have to let go of, were illegitimate, were based on lies, profound lies, lies that South Africans helped to perpetuate throughout the world about the inferiority of Black people. We were the point people for whiteness in Africa, and we played a huge role in disseminating racist theories and racist understandings throughout the world. And I think it sort of like gets us a little bit of a perspective so that we don't get into that space where we, you know, we feel that we're badly done by. I mean, we have to let go. We have to grieve those things and let them go, because we shouldn't have had them in the first place. And then also I want to say the new opportunity, I so totally agree. I think it was Rebecca who wrote about that. Hey, I so totally agree that we have an opportunity for forging new ways of solidarity now. I think, you know, as white South Africans, we've been given a whole lot of gifts since 1994. And, you know, just when we were beginning to despair of whether white South Africans would ever actually really come to the party, we've been given another opportunity for white South Africans to rise to the moment and to actually become part of laying new foundations for a society that move away from the old apartheid and racist foundations, including a new economy that can only lead to a better and more stable and a more you know, a society that's actually better for all of us, if we take that. The collective nostalgia, well, you know, nostalgia, obviously, if you're writing your thesis on nostalgia, then you know more about it than I do. But I think it's quite clear that in white nostalgia, there is this reconstruction of history. You know, it's that, you know, Baldwin said that it's the innocence itself that is the appalling achievement. So we try to use ignorance, we try to use nostalgia as a way of constructing a kind of innocence for ourselves, a kind of a space in which we don't have responsibilities. But it's that innocence itself that needs to be explained, because how could you not know? You had to make a choice not to care, because if you cared, you would find out. And so I think that nostalgia still is also a way to try and create that sort of space of innocence for themselves. And one of the most fundamental things that we have to do in white work, and honestly, I think it's right at the heart of it, is to debunk the kind of nonsense histories that we were taught. You know, we have to understand properly, you know, taking the realities of Black lives into account. We have to understand properly what the history of this country really was. What did whiteness really mean here? What did whiteness really do? And so I think that part of sort of like working with that kind of nostalgic space when we are doing white work is about putting people back to the realities of what the history of this country really has been. And then I just have one last thing to say about nannies, you know, because I think that is probably the theme that comes up whenever you work with white people, you know, and it's like, it's almost like a primal connection with our sense of loss, because lots of white people, when they talk about nannies, talk about how they loved their nannies, you know, and the violence that was done to them in being severed from the person who was actually in many ways like a primary caregiver to them. You know, I mean, they used to snuggle into their nanny's breasts, and, you know, I mean, it was a physical, close, loving relationship that a child was taught. And this is how, you know, the sort of ignorance contract largely operated through this, from teaching one that you had to deny those affections in order to become white properly. So my challenge to people who feel that violence that was done to them in relation to nannies is find her, you know, find children, see what reparation you can do in her actual life. I don't think many people have tried that, but actually, you know, some have, and you'll find her or her children.
Thank you. Good advice.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to have to bring us to a close because we are going over time, but I just want to say again how much I appreciate and admire all of the work that that the three of you are doing. It's not an easy place, and it's quite an uncomfortable place as well, but you engage it with so much authenticity and courage, and also awareness that the compassion of how much we're going to get it wrong, and how much further we still need to go. And I love that challenge, Melissa, from you. And I know some of the questions in the question and answer were how do we do this restitution, and to bring that back to self, and because it's a question we have to ask ourselves as well. How do we do this restitution? And then the answer can't always be given to us, but it's wonderful to have those indications and those challenges and those provocations of how we can do more. So I want to thank the three of you. I also want to thank our audience. You engaged beautifully in the questions and answers, and I had to choose very quickly, but I hope that we can still keep those, because I want to share that with the speakers, because there were some comments and just lovely points of engagement that emerged there. I want to also say that we will be here again next month on the 13th of May with Brindley Fortune, who will be speaking about colored identity and the violence of history. So these themes and these conversations will continue to emerge in our webinar series. So I hope to see some of you virtually again then. Yeah, and then just to say, as they're saying these days, during these times, stay safe and stay sane, and find ways to solidarity. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to announce the webinar closed, and goodbye.
Thank you, Kim.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Helgard. Thanks, Wilhelm.
Thank you.
Oh, Wilhelm has his hand up.
Yes.
No, I was saying goodbye.
Okay.
Kim, but
yes.
if I can say just one thing. As we
Of
lose
course.
our whiteness, we gain our humanity.
Yes. And I think that's what Helgard was also showing
Exactly
us.
what he was saying. Yeah.
And it is true, and it is something that helps with the challenges and the difficulties, to know that there's a lot of loss, but there's a lot of gain as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa.
Okay, Helgard.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.